Hello, and welcome to this online workshop for young creatives at home. I'm Rhys Straw. I'm one part of Underhill Creative, which is a production company based in Nottingham, who I co-run with my business partner, George Rhys-Jones. Today I'm going to talk about cinematography, and if you've not heard of that, this will be an introduction to cinematography. Now, this is achievable with any camera. It doesn't matter what you've got. If you've got your phone or the best cinema camera you can find. Cinematography is the principles of creating an image for video. So let's get into it. So first, let's start with what is cinematography. Now, a cinematographer or director of photography is responsible for the visual storytelling of a moving image. So any film you've seen, any TV show will have a director of photography, and it just includes everything. Anything you see on screen, it's part of that, which is not just the DOP's job, it's everybody's job on a crew. But obviously myself and George, it's the two of us most of the time, so we share these responsibilities of how we want it to look, what lighting we're going to use, where the angles are going to be, and over time it becomes a bit more intuitive. But these principles, which we'll talk about today, are a good place to start. And they traditionally, a DOP works with the director very closely. So if somebody comes to you with an idea and you're a cinematographer, you'll be able to interpret what they're saying into a vision and a visual thing. Don't get me wrong, directors obviously know about visuals, but it's more the creative side of film, really. So we're going to start with aspect ratio, which you may have heard of before. It's sort of standardized a lot more now these days. And you remember if you do remember, we had sort of square televisions, and now they've gone widescreen. That's an aspect ratio, which we'll talk about more. We'll talk about the placement of the camera. So that's very important, where the actual image is being received and what that means. The biggest section here is composition, which is a lot of things. I mean, this shot now, I'm obviously central, which is a composition, and there's a depth, there's a lighting, there's all sorts going on, which is a very simple shot, don't get me wrong, but that's composition. And then we'll touch a bit more technically on lighting and colour, because they play, again, a big role in creating an image. So we'll start with aspect ratio. So here's a few examples of aspect ratio. So if you see here, we've got a 16:9, which is very common. That's basically every screen nowadays is 16:9. I mean, phones have got a little bit longer, but most screens and most things are 16:9 still, as it's the standard for general screens, which can be HD or Ultra HD 4K. It can be standard definition as well, I believe, which takes me to the old 4:3 aspect ratio, which can be HD still or 4K. It's a smaller squeeze with the black bars on the edges there, you can see, which was more prevalent at the start of television, sort of black and white, and then it went into obviously colour. Now we have the industry standard, which is the 1851, which is 4K DCI, which was agreed by, the film heads. I don't know who they are, the top of the industries. This is the new standard, which you can see here with the little dog. It's a lot like 16:9, but it's just that little bit wider, and that's why you get that little black bar at the top, because these are standardized in 16:9. And that's most things you'll see at the cinema these days, obviously hopefully this year, this will be the aspect which that was shot in. For instance, The Joker, which is probably the latest film that came out, which was any good last year, that was in 4K DCI. If you watch that now, you'll see those little black bars. Then there's 2351, which is cinema widescreen, which is very common and very filmy, because you can see that's sort of to see those black bars on there, that screams film. This is a film cinema. Which, a little history lesson. So when TVs came out, obviously people stopped going to the cinema back in the day. I don't know exactly when it was, 60s, maybe before that. They decided to, okay, we need a new thing to get people to the cinema. So they came out with widescreen, which didn't really change anything, because 35mm is the film which they shot that on, which is, it's 35mm whatever the day. But then they added these black bars to it, and that was popularised as that cinema. And now here we are, 50, 60 odd years later, something like that, we're still tied to that cinema, and that represents a film. A lot of westerns use that starting out, because that gives it that wider feel. Now we go into a bit more obscure, well, not obscure, but I guess a bit more popular now, which is the 9x16, which is, we're very familiar with that, vertical video, which is mobile. Sort of goes against everything that cinematography is, but it's the new thing, and you can be creative within that, as I'm sure you've seen on various platforms, especially TikTok nowadays is all vertical. It's not the best one to use, don't get me wrong. We get asked a lot more to produce content in this way because of social media, but it's not really the best way to show a scene, as we don't see that way. We see horizontally, we see it's a new one, so we'll see what happens. Going on to the 1x1, which is original for Instagram. That was the only one you could post, which is sort of a little bit smaller than 4x3. It's very to the point. You can't really get much composition in there. It's just a square. The 4x5, which is relatively new, as it's the largest thing you can get on Instagram, so vertically it's the largest, which is a good way of getting a happy medium between 1x1 and 9x16. It sort of gives you enough to play with, but it's still not as good as the full widescreen. And then the 2281, which is the 70mm widescreen, which is very, very unpopular, especially these days. This shot here is from The Hateful Eight, which is a Quentin Tarantino film, so he's very interested in sort of film and the history of it, the background. This is basically achieved by having a 70mm film, so a film stock, physical film. So obviously 35mm is the standard. This is what I'm filming this on now, a 35mm sensor, which is digital, but they used to be actual film. That's where it comes from. These were twice that size, so you get twice the aspect, which is obviously a wider. You see the really thick black bars on there, that's why it's that. But you get a really wide frame, which can be really played with and create a lot of interesting things. So I guess it comes down to which one do you choose? I mean, there's no rules essentially, but a few things you can think about is, where will the video be published? So most things these days go online, which people produce, so you've got to think about, is it Instagram, is it Facebook, or is it YouTube? Most of these are in 16:9 or the vertical 9:16, but it all depends on sort of where it's going to go. Like a short film or an exhibition, most likely you want to be doing those in 16:9 or the cinema aspect, because usually they're projected large or on TVs. I mean, you can do vertical if that's part of the work, or a shop display there, a lot of those are vertical. But most of the time it's going to be a 16:9, as that's just natural to film in. And you can add these in after the aspect ratio, shoot everything in 16:9 and then convert it by having an overlay, or actually putting your sequence into that size and exporting it at that size. Nothing you'll have will film in square. That's not a thing. It's all cropped afterwards, you see. Another question is, I guess, who is it for? So we Underhill Creative do a lot of educational stuff in hairdressing. So you want to see as much as possible, obviously, of what's going on with people doing hair. If this was shot sort of really small in a 1x1, you're going to get a lot less detail and a lot less positioning where the hairdresser is, what's happening. So we shoot all that obviously wider. If it's a vlog or documentary, you might want to just stick with 16:9, as it probably will be online or television rather than a cinema. So you want to stick with just the standard 16:9. I mean, promotional videos, you can do what you like. It just depends on what you want to do. Going back to the 4x3, I shot something in that last year just to challenge myself in the constraints of a 4x3. That's also something you can do of go, what can I do within this aspect ratio? What's the interesting stuff I can get up to framing using that? It's a new challenge. It's something you can get up to while at the minute there's not a lot to be doing, unfortunately. Another point is, what do you want communicated? Like I just touched on there, of it creates a particular mood when you use these different aspect ratios. So again, the wide shot, you can really put a lot in the frame. So if you've got, we'll go through it more later, but if you've got one person on screen in a really wide shot, they're going to look pretty lonely, or the environment's more important, the scale is more important than that character. Whereas if you're in a vertical mode for that, it doesn't really give the same effect. So go into placement, which is where you're going to put the camera, where you're going to put the subject, which is what you're going to film. So there's a few things to think about when shooting various things. Basically, it's a wide subject, so I'm sorry if I'm a little bit vague, but I'm trying to simplify it the best I can. So like I've said, placing a camera in different ways can affect the mood of a shot very differently. So it's simple as high up, straight on like we have now, a low down shot from the side, the movement as well. How all these things come together reflects things differently. One quick tip and very important rule is the 180 rule. So that is basically 180 degrees around whatever you're filming, stay on one side of it, because that, if you don't, it becomes very confusing for a viewer. If you're shooting something from every angle, it doesn't create an environment on screen which we can understand as like, okay, they're there, that's happening in this space. If you're shooting all over the place in a coherent narrative, could work experimentally, but usually it's better to keep on one side of the action to not get confusing. And a lot of the time you have a lot of gear that side of the one side of the subject. If you go around the other side, you're going to get all the gear in the background, which you don't want. This usually is the case in most things. Obviously you could, like the examples here, you could film over one shoulder and the other. That's still within that 180, so that's fine. I mean, again, rules are made to be broken, so don't trust me on it, but it's usually the best way to go to make something make sense, which is quite important. So here's a few different examples of angles which are really simple. So here we have a high angle, which is, we're at a desk, we're looking down at the subject, which sort of it lets us, it views it from the person who's writing. It's sort of their view, so we're instantly drawn into that bit where they're writing. Whereas if this was which we do have this shot, which is just more of a straight on shot of them writing, we're looking more at the person than what they're up to, which begins to tell a story of what's happening on the desk is part of that character or person. So this is from a documentary. It's obviously it branches out who they are. The low angle here, which is used in a way where this is very focused on this little thing here, which is, it's fishing. I want to go into fishing, but it's a bit of bait, let's say. So this is the focus. That's the focus, and low down it gives this. It's a very small object, so it gives an idea of it's more important, it seems. And with the guy in the background, it gives the story of, within the actual video, a frame doesn't tell the whole story, but it shows there's a focus to this, and it sort of lower down gives it that just feel of importance, like looking up to it. It's a bit more, it's there, it's up there, and that sort of, going back to the high angle, it's semi lower importance. It's not, but it sort of gives, it's a different feel. Again, you can play with it. Like the usual thing in film is, if things are filmed from a lower angle, say a person, it's quite intimidating because they're filling the frame, they're looking from down below. Your view is a bit fearful. It's like say the big sci-fi films and things like that. a lot of shots will be looking upwards from, to make them look more intimidating rather than looking down, because that makes them look a bit weaker. It's a bit tried and tested, so I don't really go fully into that because there's different ways you can do it, but that's a simplified way. A medium angle, which you see there, that's straight up just with the eye line, as we are now, as you would be with another person. You're literally just equal. That's what it is, and it's to give, there's no particular mood, it's just you're not at odds with the person on screen or subject. It is what it is. You're just explaining it. And then we have a tilted angle, again with the little dog, which this wasn't intentional, I was just shooting, but you see the horizon line is tilted, which gives it a strange feel, an oddness to it, because it's not how we see the world. And I mean, you see a lot of photographs like this, which I wouldn't recommend it. They use it in a lot of sort of horror films, or a very famous one is the Batman series in the 60s. It's all on angles to give it that kooky feel and a bit odd and a bit off. It can be used really well in various situations, but it's not a regular one to go with, because it's just very confusing and it's not easy to work with, basically. So, but it's one you can try out again. So here we have some more technical things, I guess. So you've got a wide shot here in the field with the guys. So they call these establishing shots as well, because they establish where these things are, what's happening. These can be used in various ways, like I mentioned earlier. They can be used to single out a character or subject, or they can be used to show more. But usually you'd go show the wide, go into a medium, close up, the action, and then go back to a wide again. It just depends what you want to do. A medium wide here, which is sort of still pretty wide, but you can see what's happening on screen here. There's a guy photographing, there's the other subject, we can see where we are, we've got a good understanding of what's happening. Medium wides are common in sort of for a bit in films, let's say, because if you was to shoot a whole scene, let's say, between two characters like this, some films do and do it really well, but it can be a bit sort of, it's got to be right. Like if the whole thing it feels a little bit amateur in some ways, because it's one shot, whereas you want to see the detailed expressions, which takes us to our medium shot, which is, there's less detail, as you can see here. We can see where our character, the little dog, is, the subject, and there's a scene, you can see where it might be, but it's not all of it. Like there could be buildings in the background here, there could be more trees, a road could be next to us, we don't know, and that's another part of framing. You don't have to tell the whole story every time, and that's part of the mystery, part of the interest, but it also guides the viewer's eye straight to the dog, because there's not as many distractions, which is, again, something of the wide shot. This is quite a simple one here, but there could be distractions like there is in the medium wide. There's a lot going on in that image. It's harder to track where should I be looking, which is the main goal of cinematography. Then we have the classic, the close-up. So this is from an interview. It makes us see the expressions more, or the subject in more close detail, which tells another story, because in an interview especially you can see the expressions, which are really important to telling the story. We had a wide shot with this as well, which gives it a medium wide, let's say, because it grounds where we are, and then the close-up is the hard hitting points. It gives it more emotion. So moving on to composition, which is the biggest part of this little video we're doing. So you may have seen this grid before on camera settings or Photoshop, something like that. And this grid is called the rule of thirds. As you can see, there's thirds. So we have 3 columns and 3 rows, and they all come together to form this little grid. So imagine that on a 16:9 screen. You don't have to imagine it for long, so I'm going to show you. So here we have a shot of mine with the rule of thirds over. So I used to shoot, you can get these up on cameras, I used to shoot like this with the grid up, because it can be useful, it still is, but a lot of the times, once you get familiar with it, you just intuitively know where these lines lay. So here we have the shot in the thirds. So you're looking, the viewer's focus is in these, you see where the lines meet on the crosses, that's where things sort of need to be placed. But at the same time, there's got to be an opposite. So here we have the green line represents where the focus is of this image in terms of where you look straight away. And obviously here it's on the eye because that's where we look as humans. But because it's placed off to one side, it gives us this, the rule of thirds is a pleasing way to do it. It interprets mathematics and the golden ratio. If you follow this, your shots will look better, which can be used in many ways, which we'll see. But here we have the action is at the right of the screen, and we have a lot of negative space at the left, because we want the focus to be on the person here, because it's important. If you had the busy background, which here it's blurred out because of the aperture, going to that later, of the lens, shallow depth, we can see we're straight onto this action, and that's where we are. We'll go through a few examples so you can see different ones. Again, with the thirds. So here the focus is sort of not quite central, but it's closer to that line, and that's something I experiment with a lot. So if you place everything on the third, it gets a bit, what's the word for it? Methodical, let's say. It's a good place to start, and it's the best place to start, but once you get familiar, you can start breaking those rules, like I said. And this is, it's sort of, if it was more central, it'd be too clinical. So just off to the left a little bit, which is a bit more to this left third, it frames that in a different way. It's a bit more personable, so a little less confrontational, let's say. And see the eye line on the horizontal, the top horizontal, is very close to that. So that's another thing I'll go through again. The eye lines go on these. It's either you fill one of these quadrants basically with the action. So again here, the shot looking down at the desk, our focus is to the left this time with the green line, and it sort of draws you in sort of a spiral towards this little bit of action here with the writing, drawing, and that's sort of because the hand is on that top left point where the lines meet on the thirds, automatically the eye goes towards that and can find the action. This is something you can use to guide your viewer basically. Again, the action is now on the right lower third. We see the green line. This is a bit better lined up basically. You're never going to always get it right. It just is what it is. Get as close as you can, and that automatically we're there. We can see what's happening there. The focus is on that one spot. Again, slightly off the actual line, just makes it that little bit more interesting. But we see we've got a good separation here happening, with the floor is in the lower thirds, the action is in the centre, and the top's empty, because that's how thirds work. Again, it's the getting on those lines. So now we're moving a bit more into, it's still third, so imagine the grid on this, but this is a bit more perspective and leading lines. So moving on from the thirds, we have still using them here, definitely using them. You see the subject here is just to the right of the centre, bit more towards that right thirds vertical line. And again, like we had with the floor here is in the lower third, and the sky bit is in the top third. But the main thing here to think about is these perspective lines, which is 1 point perspective. So the point in the middle there, our eyes are drawn to that. We're drawn into the image, which is important because we want to create a mood. But our subject is just walking down this road here, and that's where our eye is pointed to. I mean, imagine it without the person in. Your eye's still drawn to that area regardless, because we're being drawn in by these leading lines from the path, from the trees. Again, it's not perfect. You can get methodical, which is good, but the world isn't always like that. So here's another example where this is more about the subject than it is the environment. So we had the wide shot there, this is more of a mid-close. So our focus goes directly straight away to the dog's face, straight in the middle there, and we see, okay, what's he looking at? And we see in the foreground here his ball, which is important, foreground, background, got more on that in a minute. And that's that sort of we're led into that by this perspective of being down here. Again, with the thirds, this is a bit more central, but we have that room on the bottom there, on the top, at the sides. We're looking in that middle bit. This is a bit more just sort of perspective of one side. So again, still working with the thirds, always working with the thirds. We're looking at that central bit again, but our lines lead left to right and they come to another 1 point perspective, but we don't have the other point perspective there. This was used just to see the environment, really. These are what I've shot in the past week, just to get out and practice, which is important. Keep things going. Work's a little bit lax at the minute of the lockdown, but it's good to keep practicing because you get better at these things. So yeah, our focus is this little, well, it's a cornfield, so it's just the remnants of a cornfield with the snow we've just had. But we're sort of drawn to that, and we're sort of led to think what could be to the right there in ways. Not fully, but it sort of it makes an environment more pleasing than just showing it straight up. There it is. It gives it a bit more intrigue, a bit more interest, which helps with the depth and the tone as well. Again, get into more of these later. This is a bit more straight up perspective again. So we have the docks of the canal there leading through to the back of the river. It's not the back of the river, but it's a meander. And leading in through the tree line again. And our focus is drawn to this swan, which is in the middle. Again, I did not set this shot up. Obviously, the swan does what it likes. But it's taking the time to go, okay, where's the shot? Finding the shot, using your thirds, using all these different things. And, hopefully it works out, especially when filming these things. Obviously, a lot of things are more scripted, like TV and film. It's all very planned out before anything happens. It's not, okay, let's see what happens. It's very much, this is how the shot needs to look. There we go, which is not always possible, but it's a good idea to plan ahead. So now we're going to talk about a bit like eye lines, and the thirds are back up, as you can see. So the orange line you see represents the eye line of our character here. So again, we're on the right thirds and our character is looking towards the left with the eye line. Our eye line is just off the top thirds there, which is sort of where you want it to be, and pretty central, I guess, on this one. But we're thinking, what's this person looking at? What's beyond this frame? This gathers some mystery and intrigue. You'll see it a lot if you study a lot of films or a lot of TV. You'll see this a lot, and obviously the next shot would probably show what the character's looking at, and then go back to the character to see the expression of what they're seeing. It's very easy. Same again here, which is a bit more of a sparse image. We had a white wall there, but you see the image. If you saw the next shot of this video, this is again very thirds lined up on the point of the top left, the lead-in line, the eye line going out through a window, which is the next shot. We've got the window, and we see what this person's looking at, and it starts to tell a story of what's this person looking at and why. What have they seen? And especially with this image, with all this, we call this negative space on the right here because it's nothingness essentially, but without that it doesn't create as much intrigue of what this character's all about. Now I'm going to go into depth of field, which again, and background, foreground, things like that. This is a really straight up example what we're seeing here. So that's George, he's my business partner. Our focus goes straight to him, probably because it's got a green box around it, but that's to demonstrate where the focus is. And then we have our foreground, which is this orange box, which is this wooden post. Now, not essential, this wooden post. Take that away, the shot isn't magically different, but it feels less intimate. We feel less closer to the action. So by bringing things into the foreground, it gives us a sort of view that we're there, kind of, because that's how we see. If we was looking at George, if we were there, we'd probably not be at this angle, but again, that helps being the low angle. We feel like we're with George here, we're with him. The next shot is what he's shooting, and it's sort of voyeuristic in a way, which is you're documenting what's happening. The camera's not really there, but it's a viewpoint of the audience. This one's a bit more, there's different depths to it. So our focus again is on the eye here, which is where we want it to be. There's some out of focus stuff at the front, which is obviously the rest of the head, and the really out of focus stuff is it's a window. We don't know that because of the depth, but that's why it gives us more focus on the eye there. But it's created real life. It's 3D. That's how life is. It's not one-sided. Like here, my shot, there's a bit of depth, and it creates this 3D-ness. I've also got a light, which we'll talk about again later, which helps separate me from this background. That's what it's about, is creating a dynamic framing which makes it look real or not real, I guess, in some ways, because obviously a lot of film is not real. But you want to create that feeling. It can be very different, or you shoot everything in focus, and that's how some films are shot. But then composition is really, really important, because everything's got to make sense. This is background and foreground again. The blue box is the background there, green focus, orange is our foreground. So we're back to the cornfield, and here we have the foreground stuff is all out of focus, because we don't want that to be where we want to look. That's not the focus, but it helps us imagine where we are in this cornfield, because our focus is in this middle bit. I mean, the pylon in the background is the background, and it's background interest, but it's not essential. Imagine if it wasn't there, it wouldn't change the shot drastically, but because it's there, it helps us create an environment and gives us some scale. It also just, it sort of leads through this shot. It's sort of, you can imagine leading a line through from the left bottom corner through that pylon, and it sort of, again, creates that 3D effect and environment, and we're there. Same again with this one, really. It's sort of, we've got the foreground stuff blurred out in the front, the background's blurred in this one as well because the shot, and then our subject again is in the middle bit on that third. And this sort of, it just creates that depth and that area. Now, I don't know why it looks so great. Don't ask me that. It just does. And essentially, you can't really avoid it with cameras as well, because this is zoomed in quite a lot. And the more you zoom in, the more depth you get. And the wider your aperture, the more depth you get. So that's just how our eyes work, and that's how camera irises work. That's the technology it's based off, our eyes. So think of how you see things when you focus on something. If I look at my speaker here, I can see the speaker, the background's blurred out. That's essentially what we're trying to create. And if anything was in my face here, like my microphone's a little bit, it's blurred out, so it creates this depth, and it helps us guide the viewer. Now I'm going to go into lighting and colour, because as you see here from the shots we have here, each three of these is from one video, and they have a particular tone, a particular feel, very different, but they go together between the shots. And this is all based on colour grading, they call it, which is, we'll go into it, but it decides what colour things need to be. Obviously this is based also on your light, the temperature of your light, and how you expose the image. So the middle one there, it's a lot darker, and obviously there's it's a bit stylized. It's got quite a sort of sepia tone to it, which is what we wanted, but it's got a very darker feel to, say, the one on the right, which is very bright, very airy, bit of low contrast. It gives it a very different feel. So going to get a little bit technical, so take notes or pause the video if you need to, but exposure is photography 101, which is, again, in videography as well, same thing. Basically stills or moving, it's the same thing. So exposure is basically the light, what the camera collects, which has various factors. Again, I'm going to simplify it because it's hard. You can't teach everything in one. So underexposed would be too dark. As you can see on the image here, it's too dark. Now that's not good. You don't want to be underexposed at any time because there's less light hitting the sensor and you're going to not be able to work with that image as much because it's too dark. Simple as that. On the other side of that scale, you've got overexposed, which is when it's too white, too much light coming in, and it gives this washed out, bleached look, which again, no good to us. But if you expose correctly, which is that middle image there, so we see everything is sort of as it should be, we've got the shadows are right, the highlights are right, that's the best footage file, whatever you want to call it, what you can acquire. That's what we're always going for whenever we shoot anything, is getting a good exposure. Now there's various tools you can use for this. They start really simple, of just looking at the screen and going, that looks right. That's not reliable at all, really. It is for a bit, but once you get further into it, like I have, you have to start relying on graphs and grids and numbers. That's just all of its maths, unfortunately. But so you've probably seen a histogram before, and if not, look if your camera's got one, because it's one of the best tools you can use and quite simple to use. So, excuse me, here we have a histogram on screen. Our black's at the left, and on the right we have white, and in the middle we've got the medium. Best exposures, depending on the scene, you want to be these like mountains, or you want to call them, whatever. They're the values, they're the light values. So the top is 100 and the bottom being 0. You basically want to be like a triangle in the middle of that, medium. You always want to be medium. But again, if you're shooting like me, I've got a black jumper on now, and that's going to be, there's going to be obviously it's going to be more to the dark side because it's black. That's how it is. But then I've got the sort of white-ish walls behind me, so it's going to be more towards the dark in this, but that's fine because I'm exposing for my skin tone, which again is very important, because that's, if you're filming a human, you want to be exposing for a skin tone, which basically, I don't want to go into it too much, but if the skin looks right, that's where you want to be. And overexposing a window or something, like a window is behind me, I've closed the blind, if that is white and overexposed, that's fine, because you want the subject to be exposed properly. Don't matter what's happening outside. If you expose for the window, your subject's going to be too dark, and that's not what we want. So you've got to sort of, with every situation, just figure that out, especially with sort of lower end cameras. There's not as much going on in the information there, so you've got to be more careful. Let's say like the camera I'm filming on now, which is a new one, I can get away with a lot because the files are really good and it's new technology. But still, it's not, say, I can wing it. I've still got to expose correctly every time to get a good image and the best image I can get, because then you can play with it in post. Another big part of this is white balance, which you may have seen on cameras going back for days. Like in film days, you didn't need it because it was film, it was physical. It depended how you developed it with the colours. But today, we have to set the white balance in camera for the camera to interpret what lighting it's under. So here in my room here, we're in daylight technically. I mean, there's daylight coming in, there were a little bit, but I've also got a light set to 5600 Kelvin, which is daylight. So you see the Kelvin slider there, which is, I believe it's a scientist, somebody Kelvin, made this scale of various kelvins, and that's the coolness or warmness of the light. I've put down here, never use auto white balance, because as soon as the light starts changing, depending on your camera, things change throughout a video, and that's not really what you want. Sometimes it's okay, like the more sophisticated ones can work it, but usually if a cloud goes over, the white balance changes, which is good because you want it to be right. But then say if something comes in shot and changes that, it might change and send all the footage a bit green, which again, you don't want. So the best thing to do is dial it in, stick with it. You can change it in post as well, but the best thing to do is use you can use a white piece of paper basically, if you've got a white bit of paper, or so I use one of these, which is 18% grey. It's just a little thing. I know basically I can press a button on my camera which gets custom white balance off of this, or I can try and set it as best I can in camera, the white balance, flash that up on screen for a little while, that's enough, and then in editing I know that's grey, so I can make that look grey, it'll look right, the footage will look right, because you can see here on the bottom we have the lady in a train station, or is it a shopping centre, not sure. So the middle image there is too warm, it's really orange. So the lights in there are probably fluorescents, which are never good to film under, but more and more, most of the time you're under fluorescents. They're not good for skin tones, so if I'm filming, I turn them all off, bring my lights in, because they're a lot better. And then on the left there, she's too cold, so too blue. So it's, if you look, reference the scale there, daylight's blue, fluorescent lights are orange. If you've got both going on, you've got to find that happy medium, which is the right image there. That's basically where you want it. Again, the skin tones look right. I don't know if that's a bit of white on her jacket there, that looks right. It's all about getting it right basically, because if you don't, you're stuck with a really warm image or a really cold image, and the more you change that in post, the more the footage will degrade and get worse, which you don't want. So obviously the shots you've seen here today are off sort of high-end cameras, and not everybody has access to those. Don't get me wrong, I've only just got access to those and been doing this 5 years. It takes a long time to get the money together and learn the skills. Like if I bought this camera when I first started, I wouldn't know where to start. The fundamentals aren't in your head. You don't appreciate the technology and the uses, because you can still shoot bad stuff on a really good camera. It's really easy to do. So I don't want you to worry about it too much if your camera can't do what mine can, because that's just, at the end of the day, it is what it is, and it'll still look fine as long as you follow these ideas of getting it right and the composition, experimenting. So dynamic range is highlights to darks and the gradation between that. So you've seen the church image here. On the left, we can see the blacks are just darker, and there's not as much detail in those highlights, in the darks, in the shadows. A lot of cameras are like this, and that's just based on how the cinema cameras are a lot more. There's got a bigger dynamic range. Like here, they call it stops. So most cameras, or say TV, has 11 stops of dynamic range, which is more than enough if you've got the shot right. But that's why films look so good, because they're pushing 15 plus stops, so you see such a wide gradation of colour and shadow and highlight. It just looks better. I don't know why, it just does. But yeah, you see the other image there of the church. You just more information's retained. That's all it's about, and you can push and pull that as much as you want in post. You can make it more contrasty, or you can make it a bit more airy like the shot earlier. It's a different feels for different things. So yeah, there's nothing you can do about that. Whichever camera you buy will have a dynamic range. That's how it is, and that's why they get more expensive too. So if you're shooting at night, your dynamic range is going to be a lot less, because there's not enough light. There's less light, so you don't need to represent a really dark shadow. There's no need, because it's black. Black's black. Go with it. Use the other range for other things. But again, that's sort of something you can't really stop or change. So it's just that it's a factor of sitting there being frustrated, of thinking, why doesn't my footage look like that? That's probably the reason. Colour depth as well, which is it's not a new thing, but it's changing right now. So 8-bit is the standard. 8-bit is, most things you'll look at today are 8-bit. Now HDR is becoming a lot more popular. 10-bit is becoming the standard, because see the graph here. I mean, I'm not sure of the full numbers. 8-bit collects, say, 10 million colours. 10-bit is 400 million colours. Massive, massive difference in terms of what can be captured and represented on screen. It's a huge deal in terms of colour grading. You can push and pull things so much more in 10-bit if your codec's right, and a codec is what you're recording to. So the higher that bitrate codec, the better. Whereas it's low 8-bit, compressed, really compressed, there's not a lot you can do. It is what it is. You're not going to be able to change that. Whereas the upper ones, which is 10-bit, uncompressed, or raw nowadays, you can do what you like. I mean, like cinema cameras, I think they do 14-bit or more. They're capturing a hell of a lot more than what consumers like me can. Which, you can buy a cinema camera, but you've got to have about 60 grand. So it's up to you. Again, there's also, going on to the sort of how colour's captured, 420 colour is the 8-bit. So you see, for every pixel, only 2 gradients are captured. 442, every pixel, 4 gradients are captured. So there's more colour, simple as that. I don't go too much into it because it's a bit technical, and a lot of it doesn't matter at this point, but it's just to show you these technical things can hold you back in terms of why my images look like this. Like if you're filming on let's say a Canon 100D, if they still make those, you are stuck with an 8-bit compressed image, contrasty. It's never going to look really pleasing. If you use your thirds and composition, it can look really good, don't get me wrong, but it won't have that filmic feel. Whereas I've got a Sony cinema camera now, and it's got the big dynamic range, it's got the lossless files, so it looks better. But also my composition and my lighting and exposure plays a big part in that still. Like if I turn this light off, I wouldn't look like this. I'd have no separation, my face wouldn't be exposed properly. It's all important. So colour grading now, which we're finishing up on, which is basically, you see the examples here, this is just how things look. And the colour, how you change it, how it changes the feel of an image. So if you've got your file, you put it in your editing software, the first thing to do is correcting it, getting it right. So if maybe it's sort of a bit underexposed, so we bump that up a bit. Maybe you want it a bit more contrasty, so we put some more contrast on. Little things like that, or how it should look basically. Then we move on to grading, which is deciding the colour. So there's 2 ways you can do this. You can either do this manually, which is fine, depending on your file, depends if you can take it as well. So over here we have the image. See the original image at the top there? It's pretty standard, pretty true to life. It's been corrected, it's well exposed, everything's right, there's depth on the face, we've got the thirds happening, brilliant. So now we move into grading, or the LUTs as well, which is a lookup table, which very common. It's a bit like a filter. So basically it looks at all the data in the footage, it decides, okay, this is red, but it's going to be represented like this on screen, this shade of red, and that changes depending on which LUT you might come across, or manually. It all depends. A LUT's a quick way of getting a look of what you sort of trying to achieve basically. It's a good way of doing things. It's become a lot more popular these days, and it's a bit sort of, I'll always recommend just get a corrective LUT and then play with it. It's a starting point, it's never a final thing, because it just takes away the joy of it really, quick and churned out. That's not what we want to do. We want to create good stuff and personal. So here the examples you can see with the first grade in the top left of these 4, that's just give it a bit more contrast, a little bit more menacing, this guy with the lighter. It's not done a hell of a lot to the colour, but it's just sort of, it's give it a little bit more in the shadows there, took the highlights off a bit. It's just made it's a little bit more pleasing. I like it. I don't know, again, it's personal preference. Whereas on the other side we have the bit more classic blue and orange. Like that's very popular. It was very, very popular in the 2000s in film because they're very contrasting colours. So if you get a colour wheel up, if you grade to the opposite sides of that, creates that automatic depth. So here our skin tone's quite warm, quite orange, whereas the background's been made blue, really teal, teal and orange essentially, and it creates that depth. It's sort of very action filmy. That's what they took, because it's automatically straight away pleasing. It's a bit quick and easy. It's not my preference, but if that's what you want, that's where it is. The one in the left there again, same again, orange and teal, but a little bit less, and really, really teal this time, but a bit less in the wall. So it's a bit more subtle, but it's there. Whereas you have the warmth on the right side. So warm, basically just all they've done there is really warmed up the highlights and made it a bit more contrasty. So again, just depends on what you want it to look like. You can get LUTs online. They're really fun to play with. I mean, I've got quite a few. Usually nowadays I shoot in something called S-Log, which is a log profile, which is basically, it's raw, camera raw, so it's really faded, really flat, really nothingness. Then you put a lookup table on it that tells the editing software, okay, there's this bit's green, this bit's blue, which is, the information's there, but you get a lot more latitude in terms of what you can do with it afterwards in terms of colour. Like you can put a S-Log 2 709, which Rec 709 is what we all see in. That's in television, not what we see, but that's sort of a standard for any screen. It's been decided for years. It's changing to BT 2020 soon with HDR and stuff, but it'll be a while. So the correctiveness is okay to 709, and then I push and pull all the different colours of what I want things to look like, which you've seen in the shots. They're all very different. That's the point of like differentiating it, or having the idea to start with, and that's where I want to go with it. I guess, and essentially that's tone. That's where we're going. Is it creates a very different feel. So if you wash out the colour and it's a lower contrast, like some things are shot, so it's quite sad. It's a bit drab. It's a bit depressing. Like, imagine, I hadn't seen it myself, but the Chernobyl series, what was on Netflix, that was probably pretty drably shot. I think the trailers I saw, pretty drab. Obviously it's a bit horror-esque, but it's not really contrasty and gritty. It's very just sad and whereas you've got a colourful and contrasty image, like, I don't know, RuPaul's Drag Race. That's really colourful, isn't it? You know, it's very pop. It's very colourful. Quite a happy thing going on. A lot of TVs like that of just, it is what it is. Boost up that saturation, make it look nice, make it look entertaining, interesting, because we react to colours, you know, that's what we do. But in film you can really play with that to create a mood. So thanks for listening, guys. I'll stop there because I've been probably going on long enough. Thanks for listening. I hope you've learnt something. With these things, there's always a hell of a lot to try and teach, and if I could do it face to face, I wish I could, because that's the best way of doing these things, and, you know, mentoring essentially. So I've been Rhys Straw from Underhill Creative. You can find us at these various things, our website, Instagram. Please do give us a follow. We're pretty new because we're coming out of this lockdown. It's been quiet, so it'd be nice to get some support. And if there's any questions or anything you want to know, just email us and we'll be happy to help out. Obviously we can't answer every question, but if you've got really burning questions, or even you're looking for some work experience, something like that, just give us a shout and we'll try and make it work. Thank you.